Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Salman Keshavji, and for those of you that don't know, I'm in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine here at Harvard Medical School, and I direct our Center for Global Health Delivery in Dubai, which is the entity that's hosting this meeting. So I just wanted to say a few words about the center, a few words about this meeting and my co-organizers, and what has led us to have this meeting with such a grandiose title, Rethinking the International System of Health Governance. But before I do that, let me really thank everybody for coming. I know some people have come from very far. Some people have, everyone is giving up essentially a weekend to be here. So we're really grateful for this. Just in looking at the papers, it just looks like such an amazing breadth of viewpoints. And so I'm very excited about that as well. I want to begin this meeting by thanking Sue Kulkarni, right here, who you guys have, yeah. She is a magician of organization who, along with Jen Puccetti, who you may have seen on some emails, and Liz and Helena, who are outside, Liz is right here, have just done an amazing job putting this together, so thank you. So the Center for Global Health Delivery, which is a center that's based here in Boston and in Dubai, is focused on thinking about how we can improve health delivery, the last mile of care delivery. And Aaron Shakow, who will speak after me, one of the co-organizers of this meeting, and I have been really thinking about, part of the delivery problem is thinking about mechanisms to actually deliver care. But the other part is thinking about the framework within which care is delivered. And we have started an initiative at the Dubai Center called the Initiative on Healing and Humanity. And Aaron is directing that initiative, and he'll talk more about it in a minute. But within that, we started looking at what is this framework within which we've all been working, and what needs to happen to it to really make care delivery happen. Now, the other co-organizers of this meeting are colleagues Catherine Admey and Tom Nicholson from Duke University, right there. And Catherine, Aaron, Tom, and I were working on a paper together probably a couple of years ago. It's called Double Standards in Global Health, Medicine, Human Rights Law, and Multi-Drug Resistant TB Policy. And as we were putting together this paper, a couple of interesting things happened. Our group, led by Paul, for the last few decades, had really been working on multi-drug resistant TB in Peru. And we thought when we were writing this paper about human rights, we would use the Peru case example. And the Peru case example was frightening. Partners in Health had gone into the northern cone of Lima, Peru, an area called Caraballo, and had found a lot of drug-resistant TB. And the Partners in Health had spoken to people from the Ministry of Health, from the National TB Program, Paul and Jim Kim in particular, and had said, look, we really want to treat these people. And the ministry people essentially said, well, we're going to ask our colleagues at the WHO if this is appropriate. And they were told, we've got the response and it's not appropriate. And this opened a lot of debate. Obviously Partners in Health wanted to treat people. And the question arose, why would you not want to treat drug-resistant TB if we're going to do it and we're going to pay for it? Why would one not want to do that? And that opened up that whole discussion. And the WHO ultimately worked with their Peruvian colleagues, brought together, a number of meetings. Paul, probably, could speak to it more than I can, but and Mercedes, who's here also, was in the room. Too much PTSD. And Mercedes, who's beside Paul, was, in the room at the same time. And, essentially what happened at these meetings were that they were told, this is the international policy, do a TB treatment, following the DOTS approach, and everything will be fine. And so the paper was about that. The paper was looking at what happened, how they insisted on not treating drug-resistant TB, how they created another therapy that was substandard that 3,000 people were put on, that ultimately 1,000 people died from while on. Please. Including one of the founders of Partners in Health, a priest that worked with us, Father Jack. He also got MDR TB and died. So this whole thing is unfolding, and it sounds almost crude to say, but these were people that everyone knew. We knew their names and addresses and their families. I mean, I wasn't there, but Paul and Mercy and others were there, and these these are people that died from a policy that was known to be substandard. So we wrote about that, and at one point, we had a lot of back and forth with the journal, which I won't really go into, but at one point they were like, well, you need to show us proof that the WHO recommended this, if this is what you're saying. And we realized as we sat down, we were like, well, they had all these committees and people were appointed to these committees, and I mean, you can get the minutes of this, but how do you, they said, well, you're asking that, you're trying to draw this line of accountability, but you don't have any proof that did they sign anything? Did they put their stamps on anything? And we're not going to publish this if you can't show us that they signed anything. So the fact that it's published would suggest that in the middle of the night, Aaron Shackhow went into some FTP server in Peru, I don't know how, I'm not even going to ask, and found these documents that had their seals and signatures on it, and downloaded it, and we gave it to them and said, well, here it is. And I was shocked that it even existed. Yeah, bravo, Aaron, for that. It was amazing. Yeah. But I think what it did for us, and why we said, this paper is a paper, but let's think about this, because you have 1,000 lives in this specific case, maybe more, because this disease spreads in the air. Who is accountable? What are the accountability processes? And then we started thinking about accountability processes. ADME has a lot of experience with South Africa, and our question was, well, is symbolic accountability enough? Do you take somebody to court? Is this a truth and reconciliation, or is this a Nuremberg trial? Like, where do you do this? Or is this a case like we're seeing with VW today, where people pay fines, and executives who made big decisions some of them are now going to jail, for over their emissions scandal. So, where on the spectrum is all of this? Where, how should we be thinking about accountability? And so that's really where the idea for this meeting was born. To bring people together from a spectrum of disciplines and viewpoints on this matter, because you'll see people in this room have very different viewpoints about this, and really, and not the question of accountability, but how we do it, and the importance of it. And so I think that's what this meeting is going to be about. And I'm, just looking at the papers, I can see that it's going to be a really, really amazing discussion. So I'm very excited about it. I'm not going to take any more time because I'd like to give our speakers more time. Aaron's going to say a few words. Yeah, and then we'll invite our first speaker. So Aaron, please.
Okay. I don't have much to add to So Salman presented this initiative, the initiative that's kind of the formal convener of this within the Dubai Center, as if it were, an entity that had been planned for some time. But in fact, in a lot of ways, this accountability project created the initiative. In other words, at a certain point, Tom and ADME had the idea that they wanted to work together as a lawyer and a political scientist and public health specialist, and to write about TB. We got together to do this essentially activist project, and we realized that. This is really a great need, some kind of pathway to praxis, some way of looking at, the urgent project of delivering healthcare to people and making meaning out of it, figuring out how, the work that people are doing in history and anthropology and in other social sciences, can help bring meaning to the work that's being done on the ground. What does it mean to bring meaning to something? Well, in this case, it may mean litigation. It means, figuring out what stories there are to be told, how those stories, can bring change, social change, legal change, political change on the ground, and figuring out the right way for the work that's being done to heal people to interact with the ways that we have of understanding it in all of these various disciplines, and the ways that the stories that are told in those disciplines overlap with each other and can bring power to people who don't have it at present. So that's the objective of the initiative, and I think that in some way, the project that inspired this conference is a microcosm of what we think should be happening, on a grander scale, more generally, not only in health but in other areas of social interaction. So we're very excited, to have this amazing group here. It's really wonderful to meet you all, and we're looking forward to a very rich and productive discussion in this first salvo of our initiative on healing and humanity. So thank you very much, and we look forward to talking.
Okay, great. Thanks, Aaron. Aaron, maybe you can set up our next speaker, and I'll just do an introduction.
Okay, sure.
So we've broken the next 2.5 days into what I think are little manageable chunks, thought chunks. We have a break every 1.5 hours, so nobody can have, their sugar levels can't go down. We have, dinners and meals in the evening. It's a chance for us to all talk. And here, what we're hoping is that in these, 1.5 hour-ish chunks, we're going to raise a series of questions, have a discussion, and then, break free for a break and come back. And the first chunk is really thinking about accountability as a social good. And we have two speakers, and I'll let you introduce both of them now. We have a speaker and we have a respondent, and then we're going to have a discussion. But our first speaker is Professor Valerie Sperling, who is a professor and chair of political science at Clark University. And her research is focused around Russia, gender politics, social movements, patriotism, and the European Court of Human Rights. And she's written a number of books that have won many awards, and you can read about them in the bio. But most notably, Altered States: The Globalization of Accountability. And Professor Sperling is going to talk to us. She's going to give us a framing lecture on accountability as a social good. And in response to that, we've asked Professor Doris Sommer, who's the director of the Cultural Agents Initiative at Harvard University, and the Ira and Jewel Williams Professor of Romance Languages and Literature and of African and African American Studies to respond. And Professor Sommer has written also a number of books which you can look at, but most notably the work, or notably to me obviously, is the book called The Work of Art in the World: Civic Agency and Public Humanities. And our hope is that they will really be able to frame for us this first stage of thinking as to why this kind of accountability is actually important and how it's part of the healing and humanity. So Professor Sperling, please.
There we go. So first, I would just like to thank Aaron and Salman for inviting me to be part of this fascinating symposium. I should tell you at the outset that when I received Aaron's initial email, I thought, why me? Like, I'm a scholar of Russian politics and patriarchy, and these days people mostly want me to talk about Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump and the role of misogyny and masculinity and machismo in politics because of this, which is my most recent book. And so that's the kind of thing I've been working on. But it turned out that Aaron wanted me to talk about another of my academic interests. He was one of the few people who read the book that Salman mentioned, Altered States: The Globalization of Accountability, which does not have quite as fetching a cover, I will acknowledge. But it is indeed relevant to the puzzle that we're all here to address this weekend. Namely, how can the international system of healthcare delivery be made to function more effectively and more fairly? So how can the constituents of that system, who are dispersed over dozens of countries and who are often not in any kind of a position to influence or have a voice in that system, how can the institutions of global healthcare delivery be held accountable to them? So while I come to this topic as rather a novice in the healthcare field, I hope I can provide some food for thought by talking about accountability and how it works, or more often how it doesn't work when we're talking about institutions that are international, that cross borders. So in my talk today, I'm going to say a little about accountability and what that is, and also how given the increasingly global or transnational nature of political institutions, how lines of accountability have gotten pretty muddled and confused. I will share some of my thoughts about the importance of accountability to democracy and the importance of seeing accountability as a common good, as a social good, a thing that's valuable, especially in a period when democracy itself seems to be going through a reversal in many places around the globe. And finally, I will offer some thoughts about accountable ways of supporting healthcare transnationally, like when and how citizens can enter that picture. So as a political scientist, I am interested in power, not my own power, but how who does have it and how do you get it and how is it used and how is it abused and what can be done when it is being abused, what can be done to stop that. Accountability is an extremely important check on power. And it's also an important case, it's also an important thing to study when things go wrong, as in some of the cases that you are looking at here at this conference, blatant failures of healthcare delivery, to be able to figure out who should be held accountable afterward. So in 2006, I started writing Altered States, which was published in 2009. And I started writing it out of sort of a broad concern with what was wrong with the world, because it seemed to me that at that time, it's a bad research question, but it seemed to me at the time that the global balance between accountability and impunity was skewed rather dramatically in favor of impunity. And clearly much of the impunity that we see in the world is a result of domestic governments. It's the result of what national states do. It's generated by governments that treat their people or parts of their populations usually, with benign neglect or worse, outright cruelty. And as somebody who studies Russia, who studies the Soviet Union, I was really interested in that. I was really interested in the ways that states can grossly mistreat their populations. But I was also interested in transnational institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, multinational corporations, the United Nations, the European Court for Human Rights, private military companies which operate transnationally, and transnational social movements, because these border-crossing institutions exert enormous influence on states and on citizens around the globe. So I was curious to find out what impact might those kinds of institutions have on the accountability impunity relationship. And it turned out that, a variety of transnational institutions are engaged in promoting state accountability to some extent. So the World Bank, for example, has anti-corruption programs, and judicial institutions like the European Court of Human Rights, and also a number of transnational social movements are doing their best to promote human rights and to push governments to abide by the rule of law, to be accountable to their own citizens. In some cases, the United Nations has tried to jumpstart democratization in really troubled dictatorships, like the one in Cambodia, for instance, in an effort to try to make the government accountable to citizens through an electoral process that would not have happened without that external intervention. And even private military companies will claim that you have to foster military security as a precondition for democracy. In other words, you get the rebels under control first, and then you can hold elections. So the question motivating my book was, in what ways transnational forces encourage or discourage a particular facet of democracy, namely accountability, in a variety of countries, as well as asking whether those transnational institutions practice accountability in their own activities. And what I found was that transnational institutions of these kinds were unquestionably changing accountability relationships. They were changing them within states, between states and transnational institutions, and between those institutions and the people they affect on the ground. So transnational forces have gained influence in policy areas that used to just be the purview of national states, like economic policy or military action. And one outcome of that is that citizens, the constituents of governments and of transnational institutions, when things go wrong, citizens often find themselves knocking on, metaphorically, on the doors of empty or invisible offices. They can't render their governing institutions, either at home or internationally, accountable to them, to themselves, to the people whose decisions, who are most affected by those institutions' decisions. So just to give you a concrete example, for example, if you are unhappy with the structural adjustment program that your national government signed off on, getting a loan from the IMF, say, in exchange for cutting way back on government spending, on education, on healthcare, there's not much you can do about it. You know, as a citizen, you have no means of changing the behavior of the IMF. This has some real political implications when it comes to accountability. One of the largest effects of globalization over the last few decades is in national states' accountability to citizens. So a transnational institution like the IMF or the World Bank has made economic policy decisions transnational instead of leaving them within the purview of a state's own citizens. And this leads to what I call in the book accountability once removed. Private military companies like Blackwater, for instance, they privatize a state function. They take it out of the public sphere, and they make it harder to maintain an accountability relationship between the public and the people exercising military power on behalf of the government. Even the United Nations, with peacekeeping forces, they might introduce those forces into an area of conflict in order to help avert violence or preserve the peace. But if those forces engage in sexual exploitation of the local population while they're there, it can be very hard or even impossible to hold those peacekeepers to account. Now, of course, there are also some positive impacts of globalization on accountability. So communications technology has blossomed in a way such as to make people around the world now almost immediately aware when a government does something, when it commits some kind of gross injustice against citizens. And there are now transnational courts where you can go if you can't get justice within a biased court system at home. And even when transnational institutions misbehave, we find out about it. But we may not be able to do anything about it. And that is in part because multinational or transnational institutions are organized in such a way, they're not organized in a way that builds in accountability in the same way that some national governments do. David Held and his co-authors in a book on globalization wrote, and I quote, "The quality of democracy depends on rendering political decision-making accountable to citizens in a delimited political community." Unquote. But when decision-making transcends the state level, how do you hold transnational institutions accountable to the people whose lives they affect? So the political community is no longer as delimited as it once was. Okay, so now I want to look at that problem a little more closely and ask, what is accountability and why does it get harder to pin down if we're talking about international institutions? So accountability, as I said before, it's a central aspect of political democracy, but how does it work? So in a democratic context, and in a minute we will talk about whether or not international institutions are a democratic context, but in a democratic context, accountability has two aspects. First, public officials are obliged to provide information about their actions and to publicly explain and justify the decisions on which their actions are based. So that's what you call answerability. The second component is enforcement, when those people in power are subject to sanctions, such as elections that end their term in office or impeachment. And that is called vertical accountability. So government leaders inform the public about what they're doing. The public decides whether or not to keep them around. In order for that vertical accountability to work, there are some things that you need. You need certain conditions: widespread right to freedom of speech and assembly, freedom of information, the electoral elements of democracy, the right to vote, political pluralism, and a free media that can publicize instances where the people in power are abusing their power. There's another kind of accountability, which is horizontal accountability. That's the kind of checks and balances thing, where government institutions check each other's power. But the sad fact is, neither of these types of accountability is really effective at controlling political leaders' behavior. Why? Term limits, for example, undermine the enforcement part of accountability. Let's say you're in your last term. There's no threat to you. You're coming out of office anyway. And with horizontal accountability, let's say Congress asks the executive to justify their decision about something. Well, the executive may resist divulging whatever information they base their decision on, or they might just lie. And the free press is extremely important here because citizens who get informed about executive abuses could then maybe pressure the legislature to impeach the executive or to pass some kind of constraining legislation. Accountability is often also discussed in terms of principals and agents, where the agents act on behalf of the principals. So in the democratic context, the agents are the elected officials and we are the principals. The voters are the principals. Technically, it's only if the principals and the agents both acknowledge that they are in a relationship that accountability can be said to exist. The growing reach of transnational institutions raises fundamental questions about these kind of accountability relationships. So should transnational institutions like the IMF be accountable to the people who are affected by their policies, or just to the finance ministers, who are actually, in this case, the principals? So the citizens aren't actually in that accountability relationship technically at all. There is, however, a move to define a type of relationship that is extremely common in world politics, where groups or individuals think an agent should be, isn't, but should be accountable to them. But the agent disagrees. So in that case, you have accountability seekers, like would-be principals. And Robert Cohane describes this as an external accountability relationship where, and I quote, a person or community is substantially affected by the actions of an individual or organization. So in that case, the principals haven't delegated authority to an agent. They're just being affected by that organization's actions. There's some impact. They want to hold the actor accountable, but there's no existing international context or rule under which they could do so. That is the situation that applies to transnational institutions like the IMF or the UN or the WHO that take actions that affect people. And it raises the question of whether international institutions are, in fact, a democratic context in which you could reasonably expect accountability or make it possible. So Robert Dahl, the famous theorist of democracy, he argued that international institutions simply lack the mechanisms for accountability and transparency that can make them democratic, that in such large institutions, so distanced from the main body of the populations they affect, accountability and control over decision-making is necessarily lacking. Other scholars point out that international institutions in these discussions are being held kind of unfairly to an ideal that you don't even see observed at home in democratic states, where accountability mechanisms are often structurally biased against marginalized groups, especially the poor. So, for example, state officials regularly close their eyes to violations of policy that are intended to protect the poor, things like workplace safety standards. And racism and sexism and other kinds of oppression also reinforce and are used to justify that absence of accountability, the sort of double standard that Salman was talking about. So in short, there are all kinds of limits on accountability within national states, but the interaction between international and national level institutions means that the sphere of accountability has become even more muddied. So in setting out to write Altered States in 2006, I was worried by what I thought was this unsettling pattern of unaccountable behavior by transnational forces of various kinds. Private military companies, peacekeepers, the IMF, the World Bank, and even some civic organizations that were operating transnationally and not behaving accountably to their constituents, to the people who were being affected. And I was also worried about democracy declining at the national level. Certainly in the part of the world that's most familiar to me, namely Russia and almost all the other former Soviet states, democracy at that time was failing or had failed already or had never gotten off the ground at all after 1991. So that was when I started writing the book. Unfortunately, with regard to democracy, between then and now, 11 years later, things have gotten worse. It is safe to say we are in the middle of a general and a global crisis of democracy after decades, from roughly the 1980s to the year 2000 or so, during which we were seeing democracy spread with the revolutions against dictatorship in Eastern Europe and in Latin America and the Philippines and South Africa, South America, we have since then seen the swing go in the other direction. Russia, the former Soviet Union, Turkey, we've seen the reassertion of authoritarian rule. In Europe, in Poland, Hungary, and other places, we're seeing this resurgence of right-wing populism and increased state control over the media and over the courts. And obviously, I don't even have to mention the shocking election outcome in the United States, where following Trump's election, we saw right-wing, anti-Semitic, racist white nationalists being hired as advisors to the president, and then the subsequent empowerment of white nationalist and neo-Nazi U.S. citizens, whose rallies thankfully have been countered by proponents of diversity and democracy and inclusion. Now, this is not just an anecdotal or impressionistic feeling about the retreat of democracy. As many of you probably know, Freedom House puts out an annual report on the state of democracy around the world, and 2016 was the 11th year in a row when we saw ongoing decline in democratic freedom. So free speech, political rights, that kind of thing. Even in democratic countries, which in recent times have seen a dramatic increase in power by right-wing nationalist and populist parties. And as the Freedom House report puts it, while in past years the declines in freedom were generally concentrated in autocracies and dictatorships that simply went from bad to worse, in 2016 it was the established democracies that had been rated free, in other words, by Freedom House, that declined, that suffered declines, that suffered setbacks. So free countries, quote unquote free countries, actually accounted for a larger share of the countries with declines in democracy than at any time in this last year than at any time in the past decade. So this retraction of democracy, I would argue, makes the role of citizens even more important in holding their own governments and international institutions accountable for their actions. However, the growth in right-wing populism that we have been seeing threatens the very basis of democracy, and therefore also threatens our ability to hold leaders accountable. So let's consider the US, right, which is a major funder of international institutions. A free media that can criticize the government is a fundamental aspect of making governmental accountability possible. Yet, a characteristic of populists in power, wherever they are, is to portray all forms of dissent as treasonous, and to claim that all criticism is untrue and unfounded. So in line with this populist tradition, our current administration devalues the mainstream media as, quote, an enemy of the people, and considers that truth as revealed through investigative journalism is not important. And so far, the administration's supporters seem to agree. So how can we construct accountability relations under these circumstances? Accountability is a social good, but step one in maintaining it is that people have to recognize its importance. Another way of thinking about accountability is to regard it not just as a process where the powerful have to publicly justify their actions and the outcomes of those actions and satisfy the desires of the principals, or else risk losing their power, but instead as a process in which the powerful bear responsibility specifically for outcomes that are supposed to contribute to the common good. That is like an activist view of accountability, where governments and transnational institutions and non-governmental actors should be held accountable for whether or not they contributed to improving the lives and conditions of poor people, specifically providing help and justice to people in developing countries. The idea there is that wealthy states and international institutions should be held accountable for their actions, for the effects of global capitalism, for the effects of peacekeeping, for the effects of global healthcare delivery, and so on. And the idea there is not just that accountability mechanisms are there to prevent the abuse of power, but also to promote human well-being. Unfortunately, people in some of the most powerful countries, including the United States, I think, seem to be losing trust in the very idea of government providing for the common good, even at home. In other words, providing for material well-being, even at home. And of course, we have that same problem at the global level. So people who don't want to support the common good at home, people who are opposed to a national healthcare system that would provide, healthcare for everybody, including the poor, those people are even less supportive of supporting the common good abroad. So our contemporary administration, as you know, is all in favor of cutting foreign aid. But that is not a new problem either. Even if we look at under President Obama, the United States started cutting its contributions to the WHO in 2011. Cut it basically almost in half, from $280 million in 2010 to $180 million in 2013. And so I think with this America First, populism that we're seeing now, that view about international aid has spread. All right, now while it seems that given this kind of cutback in democracy, that perhaps we can't count on the powerful countries' citizens to pressure our governments to care about human well-being beyond their own borders, many citizens still do exactly that. In one chapter of Altered States, I wrote about a few different transnational social movements, and I found that international NGOs, when they're acting accountably to their constituents, they can be quite powerful. So bringing citizens globally and locally into struggles for accountability can help. Aaron told me, for instance, about lawyers from the Boston-based Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, who jointly with a group in Haiti, and I think that's key, were attempting to hold the UN responsible for that outbreak of cholera following the introduction of the disease in 2010 by peacekeepers there. That the lawyers used this tactic of launching an activist campaign to back their legal strategy. And the purpose there is to try to increase accountability. In 2016, the UN admitted some involvement in the introduction of cholera in Haiti, but has continued to argue that the UN should be immune from that it is immune, from any legal action that would require the United Nations to take responsibility. And a U.S. judge in New York apparently ruled that only the United Nations can waive its own legal immunity. So it's like, only I can say if I'm guilty, right? So, and dismiss the lawsuit. And so this does kind of highlight the problem of what I referred to earlier as external accountability. How do you hold international institutions accountable for disastrous mistakes, on the one hand, and the difficulty of getting common good projects off the ground? Or accomplished, like the establishment of an effective a clean water system in Haiti, which is a country that's not going to be able to pay for doing that itself. And of course, when we're talking about really large public health and other kinds of public good projects, we have to be realistic when we think about where can that funding come from. So the leadership of tremendously wealthy people who care is very important. So generally speaking, the privatization of healthcare or any common good is a bad thing on its face. Privatization removes accountability even further from any affected citizens. But that said, if you look at the provision of public health, private foundations have made big strides in that area. People like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and groups like Partners in Health have spent big money and spent a lot of time to fight and prevent the spread of disease. In July of this year, Buffett donated $2.4 billion to the Gates Foundation, which, as you know, is focused, among other things, on improving health. They've made a huge effort toward eradicating malaria, for instance. So in theory, right, private foundations are even less accountable than governments. But a key aspect to establishing an accountability relationship is for any kind of institution to listen to what the needs are on the ground among the people who are being affected. So whether it's about strategies, like what strategies can work on the ground for addressing malaria or Ebola or female genital mutilation, FGM, or to stop the exchange of food for sex by peacekeepers. But it is a risky strategy to rely on the kindness of strangers, or in this case, we're talking about relying on the kindness of plutocrats. Because the point of international institutions is that they are institutionalized, right? They shouldn't have to rely on a handful of giant donors, but they do. I read that when the Ebola outbreak occurred in West Africa a few years ago, the WHO's second largest donor after the United States was the Gates Foundation. And in face of the fact that Donald Trump's budget ideas include cutting payments to the whole UN system, chances are, I think, that we're going to be looking at private funders of public health care for some time to come. I mentioned that a key element of bringing help from outside that's going to operate in an accountable way is to be connected and responsible locally. One of the organizations that I wrote about in Altered States is based in Mali, and they have a US partner that provides some funding to support work on ending FGM, on ending female genital mutilation. And they work in Mali at the village level. So this group, which is called Sini Sanuman, or Healthy Tomorrow, discovered early on in their work that a huge obstacle to getting villages to agree to stop cutting off their girl children's genitals was that girls marry outside the village. So other villages also have to stop doing FGM in order for the girls to be able to marry. Now, of course, the whole marriageability issue and the fact that girls who don't get married are going to be at an enormous economic disadvantage, that taps into a much bigger, broader question about patriarchy that would require a whole other level of organizing to address. But setting that aside, this group, Sini Sanaman, they operate in a way that's very responsible and responsive to the local level, and it's rooted in Mali. So what they do is they see what gets in the way at the local level, and then they work with that understanding when they design their strategy. So for instance, the women who do the female genital cutting in Mali, the excisors, they didn't know about the health damage to girls or about the risk to babies, being born to women who were excised. And it turned out they were also worried about their own livelihoods. How am I going to get money if I stop doing excisions? And so the organization got a group of excisors on board, sometimes by giving them money, and starting them off in other kinds of professions. And they got Malian musicians to make a CD featuring a song, which they also made a video out of, that propagandized the idea that it's a good thing not to get your girl children cut. And then they used the money fundraised abroad to get the video shown on Malian TV, to get the song played on the radio. They put up a bunch of billboards around Bamako. And they're making a difference in changing public attitudes so that then the local public can challenge the Malian legislature to pass a law that would ban FGM. And for years, they've also been collecting signatures, again, from local people on a pledge against excision. And they have 75,000 signatures, which they've presented to the legislature. So that strategy is a very different kind of strategy from the strategy that uses international pressure on a state to comply with the demands of outsiders or Westerners to stop FGM. So this year, Sini Sanaman is operating on a UNICEF grant, and what they're trying to do is pass a law against FGM and against violence against women. And the grant supports some of the same kinds of media work, so broadcasting the songs and the videos that the group was doing before. And it also supports legislators in Mali who are in favor of the law against FGM. It supports them to go to their constituents and talk with them about not cutting their daughters. And then Sini Sanaman tapes those talks, and they're going to make a PSA, a public service announcement that could be put on Malian TV. So again, having local respected people talk to the public. So in the face of profound accountability deficits in a lot of international institutions, this kind of organizing strategy includes a more democratic conception at its root, because it's tied to, and in many ways, it's driven by the local population. A last point that I want to make. We shouldn't make the mistake of blaming international institutions for accountability failures and letting national governments off the hook when we do so. While it is true that many international institutions are really unaccountable, and that's very problematic in ways that are going to be discussed a lot here this weekend, all those international institutions are made up of representatives of national governments. And many, if not most of these governments, are themselves quite unaccountable to their own citizens. So if we're going to insist that international institutions adopt accountability as a good, as a social good, it stands to reason that we would have to get national governments to recognize that accountability is a social good first. We are talking about something here that is really not easy to accomplish. I began this talk by mentioning that that democracy itself appears to be on the decline. But states are made up of people. They're made up of citizens. And I guess I'm an optimist in that I believe that most people want to do good. That said, people can be very limited and very self-interested in their ideas about who deserves to receive public goods. You know, during Hurricane Harvey, I was thinking about how when Hurricane Sandy hit New York, the entire Republican congressional delegation from Texas voted against federal funding for disaster relief. Well, now, of course, they're all in favor of federal government expenditures to help Texas recover from Hurricane Harvey. My point is that I don't know how we can teach people to get past provincialism, but having more and more citizens of countries conceive of themselves, conceive of ourselves correctly as being citizens of the planet, you know, especially in an era where national borders cannot protect us from, you know, pollution, disease, weather disasters, what have you. Seeing ourselves as part of a global public would seem to be a key ingredient in convincing the leaders of the world's countries that they have a responsibility to support the common good, to support the public good, and to behave in accountable ways, whether they're operating at home or abroad. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I too want to thank very much Salman and Aaron for this invitation. I come from even farther afield than political science. I'm from the humanities. And what are the humanities doing here? I'm so happy to hear Valerie talk about an effective campaign in Mali, which not only activated women who are excisers, but musicians, and turned the music into a campaign. The question here that I want to consider with you is, who are the musicians, who are the arts activists, who are the active citizens in campaigns like this? Are they local respected people who can do public service announcements? Or should we be talking about a very broad base of citizens? Citizens who are not only international now, but also local and engaged in a variety of ways. So that's the link. You'll see, I hope, lots of links with the work that I want to do and the work that Valerie has been doing so admirably. So where I want to start is to ask, why is art an issue for accountability and for global health? What does art mean? Lots of people will say that art is a vehicle of expression, as if ideas and feelings preceded art. Practitioners would probably say that art is a vehicle for exploration and for making meaning. When Aaron talked about identifying meaning, bringing meaning, what artists talk about is making meaning. How do we make it? So you also mentioned, Aaron, that we are scientists and social scientists here. Well, we're stretching a bit by inviting the humanities. And I want to say something about that stretch. And I'll mention a key word that Raymond Williams gets us to focus on in his book called Keywords. And some friends have heard me say this before, but it's basic to the links that I think we can be making. Raymond Williams came back from World War II and said, I don't understand English. I've just been away for 4 years. I came back to Oxford. I don't know what people are talking about in my own field. What does culture mean? And after investigating and talking to enough people, he decided it meant two very different things. If he talked to social scientists, culture means an inheritance of shared beliefs and practices. That's the way social scientists and probably medical scientists think about culture. You come into a new situation and you want to understand its culture, right? How do humanists and artists think about culture? They think about it as a laboratory of trial and error, of breaking paradigms, not identifying them, but knowing enough about them to cut, to refresh, to try something out, to give it a twist. So these are two warring, maybe complementary definitions of culture, because if we don't understand that culture is an inherited package of beliefs and practices, how are we going to make an intervention from the arts? We don't know what we're intervening in. We don't know where to land. When artists say they make an intervention, you ask them, well, what did you do? Have you measured anything? They think that's outside of their realm. And when you ask a social scientist, what are you going to do with the culture? They say, we don't do with culture, we just try to respect it, understand it. The invitation here, and I think that Valerie's presentation makes that invitation, is to imagine bridges where we can be creative and responsible. So we need both of those sides of culture. My favorite slogan on the arts and humanities side of culture comes from a play by Endgame. Why am I not remembering his name? He was right there, Waiting for Godot. Beckett. Beckett wrote Endgame, and in Endgame, he has a character say, try again, fail better. Fail better is that liberating moment where you know you're in a process. You're not getting anywhere that is definitive. You are in a process of trial and error. So art is much more than expression. It's living with skepticism because you know that the paradigm you have identified is not solid, not if it's a cultural paradigm. Skepticism and imagination. It's not enough to study. It's necessary to think differently, to make another cut. Art denaturalizes social paradigms, cultural paradigms. And if we want to make interventions in medicine, in politics, in any kind of practical area, we have to refresh a frame and see how to intervene. Without art, that is impossible. Art means refreshing the frame. It means intervening. Everyone who is an active citizen, who is a thinker, who is a leader, but who is active as a citizen, is an artist. And this is a long tradition in Enlightenment thinking that comes from Friedrich Schiller, and anybody who has interest or patience for talking about Enlightenment aesthetics, we can talk later. But everyone who is active is an artist. And I've already said why. It estranges the situation. How do we change a situation if we don't look at it as if it's strange? And that word, estrangement, comes right out of Russian formalism, so there's another connection. Art is about self-efficacy, because if you know that paradigms are changeable, that they're intervenable, you know you can make a change. And so an artist, even if you're singing a tune and you make a new harmony, if you're drawing a picture and you decide to make a corner rather than an arc, use red rather than blue, you are making decisions. Training children, treating each other as artists is a way of acknowledging the small increments of change that are possible when we think of ourselves as artists. Any poor person who knows how to recycle one thing into another, tell me if they're not an artist. And they understand themselves as artists. You make do. You create something. In Spanish, one of my favorite expressions is de tripas corazón, from tripe, from your guts, because you don't have a real motor, you make a heart. De tripas corazón. That's the logic of recycling, of making art where resources are limited. So it's the play drive, what Schiller called the play drive that makes us all active. And if we can locate that kind of activity in each of us and recognize that in each other, we admire one another. And admiration, I learned from my favorite cultural agent, is the basis of citizenship. It's not respect, it's certainly not tolerance, it's admiration. When we recognize one another as artists who can come up with a new twist, with a new way to recycle, we admire one another. So one of the questions I want to ask is, what does delivery mean? When we talk about experts who come and deliver health, what relationship does that establish with other people, with victims? And I think that what Valerie was pointing to in her last case was a co-creation of an intervention. So delivery might be an invitation to collaborate. I think if we don't have that definition of delivery, we confirm a hierarchy that keeps people in the position of recipient, possible victim. And we keep ourselves in a higher position that doesn't address systems, but has more of a stopgap approach to delivery. Because to address a system is to create a broad base of agents. People need to participate in their own care. Otherwise, the care is short-lived. So when we talk about democracy, to go back to that important tradition that is so vulnerable and losing so much ground today, democracy is a combination of assumptions. One is that we have a right to participate, but another that we forget is that we have an obligation to participate. We have an obligation to participate, and if we form citizens with that assumption that they have to come up with something, that they have to show up, that they have to vote, that they have to be on the street, we have another force in creating the kind of accountability and mutual accountability that will give us longevity with interventions. So how do we reinforce a culture of accountability that is based and requires democracy, which in turn will reinforce accountability? How do we do that? Well, education is one way that most states have understood they need to develop democracy. When we pretend to educate children and youth by sitting them in rows with one person in the front in large groups, what are we doing? How are we training people? I mean, here we are in a seminar. We can all see each other. Once in a while, somebody talks in the front, and we'll have a conversation. This is an elite group. What happens in a regular public school classroom in Mali, in Boston, in Bogota, anywhere? People sit in rows with one person in the front who knows all the questions and all the answers. What are we teaching children and youth? We're teaching them authoritarianism, and we're teaching them corruption, because people in the back who are chit-chatting with each other and doing what they need to do, sidestepping the system, know that they'll get what they want, and they don't have to deal with the rest of us. Or they'll figure out how to talk to the teacher after class. But they don't have to look at one another. Looking at one another, being in circles, being in small groups, talking, being vulnerable and visible to one another is being accountable. And these are habits. These are habits of the soul. These are habits of political behavior that we need to inculcate at every level. So I wanted to show you two visuals and then really break so that we can talk to each other. Otherwise, otherwise I'm guilty of the same thing that I say to my colleagues. We can talk about democratic education, while one person gives a lecture and everybody listens, right? So I don't want to go there. But I want to show you a visual, and some of my friends have seen this before, but I want to show it to you with another level of reading. This is 2 minutes from a video that you can see on YouTube called Bogota Change, and it's about the incredible contribution of a creative mayor in 1995 in the worst city in the Americas, probably in the world. Some of us remember signs in international airports that said throughout the 80s and half the 90s, don't go to Bogota. Don't go there. The State Department won't go after you. Your health insurance won't work. It's too crazy, it's too corrupt, it's too violent. Don't go, right? Well, a philosopher and mathematician who's also a wild card got elected in a desperate city because the city didn't know what to do. And he wanted to know how to make a visible change so that people would go after the drug traffickers. Create a feeling of change is possible. So he decided to go after street traffic before the drug traffic. And he asked everyone for a good idea. No one came up with a good idea. And his Secretary of Culture said, look, boss, there's nothing to be done. It's time to bring out the clowns. So because Mocus is a wild card and he's an artist, and decided he wasn't going to get offended, he was going to be literal, the way some artists and children are. He said, all right, that's a good idea. I want you to see what he did. But the clip starts with another stunt where he issued 40,000 large format cards with thumbs up on one side, thumbs down on another. Each citizen got a card in the center city. Each citizen got a card in the center city. And mutually regulated pedestrians and drivers with approbation and disapproval. And then imitated cops on the streets. So let's see. Bogota, 1995. Oh, here he's super citizen.
Hay una cosa que se trabajó en la 19, que es la persona que se mete en el nudo en la intersección. Pues el que no quiso esperar el siguiente turno y obstaculizó. Esa persona yo creo que merecería una tarjeta roja.
Todas estas actitudes que para quienes viven en Bogotá ya son pan de cada día, serán en adelante sancionadas.
El que se queda, aunque tiene el espacio vacío al frente para que puedan pasar los otros, a ese mostrarle la tarjeta blanca. A medida que afinemos ese diagnóstico, podremos dar el mensaje social de qué comportamientos son los que más impacto tienen sobre la congestión.
Ustedes ven allí la mampara. La mampara es el sitio donde puede haber un policía o puede haber un ciudadano cualquiera.
Eso.
Cuando un conductor ve a un ciudadano cualquiera asomado allí, no sabe si es un policía o no es un policía. Es la máxima expresión de la autorregulación.
Yo decía, estos son 6 millones de habitantes. Estos juegos no logran transformar comportamientos. Yo tenía una actitud bastante incrédula frente a eso.
No fue fácil. Estaba rodeado de muchas incomprensiones. La gente intuía que él iba para alguna parte, pero no sabían muy bien para dónde.
Yo recuerdo que cuando él empezó, inventó los mimos, la prensa se reía de Antanas.
De estos largos y oscuros túneles ubicados bajo el centro de Bogotá, se preparan 20 jóvenes que pretenden enseñarles a los habitantes de la ciudad cómo vivir civilizadamente en una capital.
Es a través del arte, ¿sí? A través de nuestra postura de la estética y de la ética, vamos a poner en servicio nuestro trabajo para dar educación ciudadana.
creo que la disposición a dejarse corregir es el complemento que espero frente a los mimos. O sea, los mimos solos no bastan. Ahora necesitamos que la gente acepte al mimo.
Okay, if you want to see 1 hour of this movie, just look for Bogota Change on YouTube. You'll see it. There's a wonderful moment there where Antanas takes seriously again, in a kind of literal way, a metaphor that he learned from an epidemiologist in Cali, Colombia, who became the mayor of the city. And Rodrigo Guerrero, the epidemiologist, discovered the metaphor that violence works like an epidemic, like an infectious disease. So one thing that Mocus did was a campaign called Vaccine Against Violence. Domestic violence was the germ that was infecting the whole society. And he, just see the movie and you'll see what his campaign, Vaccine Against Violence, looks like. But it was one creative activity after another. He didn't make them all up. He had artists come and make proposals, and another proposal, another proposal. The reason that he's dressed as a super citizen is because some artist came with the Superman costume for him, and he said, "This is for you." So he wore it around town for a little while until one woman said, "Okay, Mr. Mayor, we got the point. Now look decent, okay? Go." And then he did. One more example. My friends here know that what occupies most of my energy now is a campaign in literacy through the arts, because, as I say, when children and youth understand themselves as artists, they feel empowered, even if they have to play with difficult academic material. And we call this program Pretexts. One of the facilitators in Pretexts is a human rights lawyer from Costa Rica. He lives in Puerto Rico now. And he worked with me in a program we did in the Bahamas with the IDB. And later, he was asked to do a survey on the human rights abuses of Haitians in the Bahamas. How is he going to do that? He is a Costa Rican living in Puerto Rico, going to the Bahamas to work with Haitians who speak Creole. How's he going to do that? Well, he did it with pretexts. Because pretext starts with listening to a text, asking the text questions, speculating on answers, and then reflecting on what did we do. So I just want to show you what Marco Abarca managed. And with this very simple system of creatively engaging everyday people whom you just assume are creative and brilliant, he did an in-depth survey of 1,000 Haitian immigrants in 1 week. Because he worked with 50 citizens, not legitimate citizens in the Bahamas, but 50 Haitian immigrants who asked their questions, hung them up on a line, which means that men and women had equal visibility. Here's one of the questions. If a foreign woman have kids with a Bahamian man, why don't the kids have Bahamian passports? They had just read a law that didn't make sense to anybody. And they could formulate the questions. So when these bilingual Haitian Bahamians went and interviewed house by house, they had good questions that they could ask in Creole and then report. Marriage is honorable in all. Why does unmarried people have more rights than married people? Okay, so these are some of the questions that are formulated, as I say, and equally visible among men and women, which was not necessarily the case with all of the relationships among the Haitians here. Here's a last frame where everyone, men and women, get together in a circle and pose a simple question: what did we do? what did we do? How did we formulate the question? How did we address the question? How did we talk to each other? And everyone has only 1 or 2 sentences so that an even keel, democratic tone is established so that there isn't one person grandstanding and women aren't locked out of the conversation. So with these simple prompts and lots of room for creative interventions by everyone, Marco Abarca did serious work in short time in a very effective way. So that's what I wanted to share with you is the capacity that we have as teachers and trainers to engage large bases of co-producers of global health and to think of delivery as a co-creation. Thank you so much.
I was thinking maybe you could stay up for a second and maybe Professor Sperling could come and we could have a bit of a discussion about this. I want to start off the discussion by asking a question, and then I think hopefully everyone can weigh in. I think this is fascinating, what you've just shown, Bogota, and what you, Professor Sperling, discussed about the coming together in Mali around the genital mutilation. But I think one of the questions that really is going to drive these sessions, and certainly when we look at the history after the break, is a question that you asked, Professor Sperling. And you said, when decision-making transcends the state level, how does one hold people accountable? Because it's really the examples that you've presented that are really quite forceful, involve citizens interacting with the state and the fact that you can see people. And that can bring out this aesthetic element of justice and of accountability. And I think, but how do you do it when we've created these frameworks, we've created moral worlds or even ethical systems that allow us to completely not have that kind of accountability? And I'd really be interested in your thoughts, because this one-on-one thing is great, but I was recounting to colleagues last night that, in one of the heated arguments about TB, and talking to one of the leaders of the TB system, I said to him, I said, you're a public citizen. You're accountable to the people that you serve. And he actually looked at me and said, I'm accountable to nobody. I'm accountable only to Margaret Chan.
Wow.
Well, she's gone now, so I suppose you're not even accountable to her. But, so you have, that made me I was thinking of that as you're presenting this, because we've created a system where there isn't an accountability frame. So I'd love to know your thoughts on that and open it up to what others have to say.
Well, I think that's a very powerful point, and I loved your presentation because one of the courses I teach at Clark in Worcester is mass murder and genocide under communism. And, we spend the whole semester looking at all these gross human rights abuses by states against their citizens. And at the end of the semester, and to a certain extent throughout, we talk about how do you prevent this, right? And the answer is always education, that you have to, from a very early age, you have to teach kids that there's no superior and inferior. That there's no, that there's nothing good going to come out of setting up any kind of social hierarchy. The blonde kids are better than the dark-haired kids, or boys are better at this, than girls. You just have to teach children to intervene and interrupt whenever they see the creation or embodiment of a social hierarchy. And so I don't know how you do it now. How do you go in now and change the UN's behavior and change the WHO's behavior? I'm more puzzled in a way about how do you do that, except through having citizens hold their own states accountable and say, the sorts of things that you dug out of the server and Peru, that's not acceptable. Nobody should fund the WHO if that's going to be, the way that they treat third world people, right? As according to this double, standard. But then isn't that kind of even worse than nobody funds the, in other words, if you're going to try to apply accountability principles and say they're not behaving, if they're the agents and we're the principals and we don't like their behavior, well, we should cut them off. We should boycott them. We should do something like that. But then there's a whole lot of people who aren't going to get even basic, assistance. So I don't have an easy answer to that. But I do think training citizens in democracy and doing it in the classroom from a very early age has got to be a first step.
Yeah. Anybody have any thoughts? I Sinead?
Thank you so much. Really, really stimulating. I actually, I did a PhD on accountability, NGO accountability, actually, in the sort of what they say at the global level, all the way down to sort of what it looks like at the village level in Uganda. These sort of systems that have been put in place. I specifically looked at ActionAid, and I guess I changed my view a lot on accountability over the sort of the course of those years, and so I almost wanted to kind of raise a maybe slightly provocative question on the notion of accountability as a useful term sometimes, because I actually I started my PhD very sort of as a practitioner, very gung-ho, I'm going to help NGOs be more accountable and so on. And by the end of my PhD, I was actually recommending to NGOs that they not use the term because it was a distraction. And that was really because, we had at that time all these, corporate social responsibility initiatives. The World Bank had their big accountability thing. All these NGOs were setting up all these systems, and I'm sure, there's different types of other organizations as well. And a lot of it just wasn't real on the ground. But because they were doing it, they were kind of getting off the hook of doing anything real. So they had a lovely brochures, and there were, really nice kind of window dressing. And that actually reduced the pressure on these organizations. And so, it's just to sort of raise that caution a little bit, because I think, you talked about the sort of definitions and so on, and I guess the definition of accountability that I kind of ended up with, the sort of traditional one, really does depend on, it's like, this person is called to account by this authority. But as you very, clearly pointed out, we don't actually have those authorities. We're in a very, very murky space with these, transnational organizations, and so it's actually. But then they're like, oh, we'll do it voluntarily. Well, actually, voluntary accountability is not a thing. Like, it's not. And if you say it is, then actually you might be just sort of creating a distraction and a nice sideshow over here, but actually allowing all the very, problematic dynamics to continue. So just maybe for us to be very critical about that term.
I mean, I think just very briefly, I think what you're talking about when organizations engage in upward accountability, right? Oh yes, we've done X, we've given X number of vaccinations, and here's our report, which we give up to our donors. What I think we're really wanting to see is downward accountability, right? Where groups like NGOs are actually responsive to their citizens.
That's what I was looking at, but I was finding that there was all these organizations that had these systems for quote unquote voluntary downward accountability, which again, I don't think is a thing, and they were spending their, what they were actually doing was doing a lot of upward reporting and so on, and the reality is they do clash. You can't say I give the Gates Foundation what I promised to give them in terms of indicators, but at the community level, I ask people, well, what do you really want? And those things just magically are going to match up. And so, I ended up with two recommendations for NGOs. One was, stop talking about accountability, start talking about power. Why is it that people at the community level are afraid to tell you? And I spoke to people at the community level, and they said, you think we're really going to tell this NGO what we really think? Something is better than nothing. We're poor. Like literally, people using those words, like poor people like us, we don't have. We can't come along and say they tell us there's a complaints mechanism. We will not use that complaints mechanism. So one is power, and being very frank about the power differential. And then the other was, NGOs being actually honest and open about the fact that there is a clash between upward and downward, and everybody, you can't be all things to all people, and sometimes they'll have to make difficult decisions, but be honest about it and stop pretending that they were doing this voluntary downward accountability. So,
Paul,
well, I mean, I think first of all, I'm very grateful for the poignancy that you've just injected into this discussion, having seen what Sinead has described again and again in place after place, and also poignant. And I just wanted to get back to your initial presentation. Just as to be very critical of self-critical of notions like accountability, notions of freedom are also as you implied are also amenable to enormous distortion. I mean, there's probably some words that we should just ban, you know. They use, you know, resilience, accountability, and they're being used for purposes that we do need the humanities to look at, that we do need the historians to look at. And just the poignancy that struck me in hearing your presentation for Doris's response was the period of, you know, increased freedoms, you know, that you mentioned. You mentioned the 80s. Of course, this is also the rise of neoliberal ideology in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, and the collapse of political and economic rights. And you know, if you're looking at this from the, you know, this being this complex series of topics that are going to range from you know, Nepali stool going into a Haitian stream to, you know, we have an idea of some of the things we're going to hear about. Looking at it from the point of view of someone interested in those basic services, water, education. Yes, we want education where kids aren't sitting in the kind of row, but you know, there's a lot of people who were telling Sinead in Uganda that, hey, we're poor people, we don't trust these NGOs enough to tell them this. The reason is because they rely so heavily on any source of any kind of material assistance. So with the rise of inequality and the rise of certain kinds of freedoms, has come a decline, a striking decline in access to basic social and economic rights, or in areas where there were few to begin with, a continued erosion in advocacy for them. And I know there's not, and I know we'll have a chance to discuss this throughout the weekend, but I guess my question is, what do you make of that as political scientists? Because, you know, we, Salman, myself, others, watched that collapse and its catastrophic effects on the health and well-being of people in the former Soviet Union, including prisoners, even as we watched the victors of the Cold War celebrate that collapse. And you know, to see such a spectacle, and Salman wrote about this in Tajikistan, to see such a spectacle, and also to see lawyers and jurists from across Europe and the United States celebrating this was you know, just still something that leaves me speechless, you know, and I'm talking about those years, the 90s. And you know, that's not really a question for him. I wasn't intending to make a speech, but you know, if we can't stay focused on the poor, as both of you have mentioned, and their right to survive, you know, whether we call it a political, a social, economic right, and there are people here from the legal field who have expertise. How do we bring these poignant processes together in any way that makes sense in a discussion of accountability? I mean, I'm an upbeat, happy, optimistic person, but I just don't I don't see what strategy of accountability can harness a political economy that's so destructive and growing more so. And I'm looking for them. That's why I'm here.
Do you want to answer this, or do you want to take the three comments that are pending and then answer it all together? If you want to do one by one, you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I do, but I would like to hear people.
Okay, then Lynette, do you want to give your thoughts?
Thank you so much. I must say that I'm close to tears. I don't know, I'm besides myself. This is too much, it's beautiful. Thank you so much for those submissions. I just wanted to speak to you a bit, perhaps something about, you know, in terms of holding national governments even accountable and how difficult that is getting. I come from the SADC region, which is in the southern tip of Africa, and it's made up of the 15 countries and the southern tip. And for some time now, we were really lucky that we actually had a tribunal that you could go to. It was called the SADC Tribunal, where you could go to as an individual, where at national level the systems had failed, and actually take a case. It was an independent body, they took the cases, and we as civil society organizations really got a lot of headway. Until so many cases were taken up around human rights violations, especially coming from Zimbabwe. And Robert Mugabe literally met with Thabo Mbeki, and they decided that actually we need to shut this tribunal down. Within a space of 8 months, there's no SADC tribunal. Basically, what you need to do is hobble and grovel at a national level until really you don't know where to go. Nobody really cares about you. And at the African Union level, we do know that a lot of these structures are just toothless. The African court doesn't work. So a lot of us are really trying to utilize national courts to get our way, but even that, holding our states accountable is becoming really quite a monumental task. So to us, most of us do know and feel that really democracy is dead, if ever there was such a thing, or maybe we just, we were laboring under illusions. Talk about the gag rule right now. A lot of organizations have to still accept money in my region, and a lot of them are signing the gag rule, meaning that they're not going to provide services to sexual and reproductive health and rights, meaning that they can't talk about abortion, meaning that they really need to choose. So civil society is really stuck. We're also not stuck on accountability, we're stuck on sustainability. We're being asked, how are your programs sustaining work that you're doing on the ground? A lot of our donors are asking this. The foundations are asking, the global funds are asking, and we do not have the answer, because our national governments will never fund human rights. Human rights, again, as you know, is a Western concept that's been brought by the white people to people like Lynette, who are privileged enough to go to school at a white school, and now here she is talking about human rights. It's culturally inappropriate to talk about human rights. And there's no agency when you're poor, so of course that's scary. In terms of you, Prof. Summers, I really hope I look like you one day. You're amazing. You just blow my mind. In terms of visualization and doing the arts, I think, when we dealt with a disease like HIV, people literally look like Schneebel. People were dying, they had lesions, they looked bad. So there was really a strong cause. These days, people do lose a lot of weight from tuberculosis, but people are seen as being witchcraft. So it's witchcraft that's been blamed on tuberculosis. And of course, we know we've got dots in BCG, so shut up, civil society, you don't know what you're talking about. That is a very different thing. And we're asking ourselves, how do we do work around tuberculosis? How do we use the arts in tuberculosis in order to get us ahead in the education? And what sort of guerrilla warfare tactics do we need to put in place? Because we really do need guerrilla warfare. We can't copy what we did in HIV. It's not going to work with TB. Unfortunately, we are trying, and it's not really getting us anywhere. So we need something else to rejuvenate our strategies and how we do that education.
Professor Purcell?
I'm sitting here as a sort of scientist thinking, you took me to a place around trust, and that we're really describing trust. And the way that I think people vest in others, their followership, and how we're describing systems out of balance. And it sort of reminded me of some work that Paul Zak did, who's an economist, who looks at the biological basis of trust. And I'm in that system, in order to have pro-social behaviours in the way that you're describing around healthcare, you need to have accountability. You need to have a punishment mechanism in its broadest construct. So I think what I was hearing when I was being taken to was that space of trust, and therefore some of the work around leadership and governance and decision making. So I'd just like you to reflect a little bit. It's interesting that Paul mentioned trust as well, but that trust as the backdrop to much of what you're describing.
Okay, Rob?
Thanks. So Rob Yates from Chatham House in London. I think when looking at issues around accountability in health, one of the big questions has to be, accountable for what? I mean, what should people be expecting of their governments and international organisations? And this is always a sort of a tricky situation. But I think that coming out of the whole SDG process, there is this new sort of focus on universal health coverage as something that all nations have signed up to. And there's been quite a debate about this in the health world. I'm of the school of thought that actually this is quite a good thing, that people do understand universal health coverage. The idea that everybody, literally everyone on the planet, gets the health services they need, but with financial protection as well. You know, not this idea, well, there are health services there, you can go and buy them if you want. That doesn't count. You know, so people have got to be able to access them without suffering financial hardship. And all across the world, I sort of see this as a concept that people understand. People demonstrate in the streets for it in the United States. They do in Indonesia. In the UK, you know, we're very lucky to have the National Health Service, but every so often there'll be a new experimental drug will come along that we don't pay for, and it'll be all sort of blown up over the newspapers. Do you think that, you know, that this is a sort of a good construct, that, you know, this is a sort of a useful concept that, you know, that we can rally round, and that is just as applicable in SADC as it is in India and across the world? Because I think this will be very useful to be able to not only hold governments to account, but international organisations as well. And I think we're going to be hearing lots of examples of misdemeanors of international organisations in the next couple of days, which blatantly will take countries away from universal health coverage. So I think we can spot where these misdemeanors are occurring. So I'm quite a fan of this, but I'd be interested to hear your views as well.
Mona?
There's also the question of accountable to whom. I mean, the fundamental premise is that accountable to the public, accountable to humanity. But when humanity itself doesn't care, how do you mobilize public opinion to mobilize that pressure or that attention or that awareness of the need for justice to be done, or to at least be seen to be done? Several examples in the national context. For instance, when Trump can say, I can stand in the middle of a Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and nobody's going to care, nobody's going to turn against me. That erosion of the fundamental sort of debt you owe to society is gone. You know, that I will respect the law in order to be just a citizen in good standing, much less a potential public servant leading the charge. When policemen are shooting citizens, unarmed citizens, black predominantly, and nobody cares, then there's a fundamental disconnect between the citizen and the society, and what the society owes the citizen. Similarly, in the Haiti context, which is, you know, the issue that's near to my heart, nobody seemed to care. Not even their own government seemed to care, or at least not enough to do anything about it. And for years we were waiting, you know, justice somehow, forget about justice being done, just somebody asking for justice to be done was missing. Until the lawsuit emerged, which is probably not necessarily the most effective way to resolve the underlying wrong, but it was finally something that drew attention to it. And it wasn't until years later when Philip Alston's reporting and his predecessor special rapporteurs did try to bring attention, but it was really until the attack on the UN was made that anybody even started to care, and they didn't even care for the right reasons. They weren't caring about the victims, the dead or the living ones. They were caring about the legacy of the Secretary General. They were worried about, you know, the UN's, you know, long lost moral credibility. So were they even caring for the right reasons, and did we care that they cared for the right reasons? Was it finally just the fact that they cared that mattered, and that invited a response finally, as inadequate as it was? So that disconnect with that, you know, what does the citizen expect from the institution or from the government or from their fellow citizens even, has to be as much part of the conversation. And how do we reawaken that sense of, not entitlement, but that sense of, I deserve it, I deserve justice, is just as much part of the conversation, or at least has to be.
Yeah, I'll be real quick, sorry.
Kenyon, then Roger, then James.
Sorry. Yes, I was thinking in the first presentation. I was thinking in the first presentation on this question of accountability, and would agree whether or not this is even a useful term, so just bracket that. I was thinking about the kind of context where, so we're talking about global health and kind of the, you know, multilaterals and some of the international NGOs or whatever, but you know, I'm just also thinking about it in the context through which there's unaccountability at the government level, but then also the ways in which kind of, you know, multinational corporations are further and further and further unaccountable, right? And kind of move capital to where there's the least amount of accountability, and even sort of divvy up, sort of stocks and bonds in such a way. So we have a situation in the United States where, people are, losing their homes, but nobody can tell who actually owns the financing, the mortgage anymore, right? Because it's been divided up 50,000 times. And so we've had some success where states have, or judges have thrown out those lawsuits to, because, and you're seeing that even in student loans to some extent, right? So I'm just thinking about kind of what does the, citizen, in a country sort of expect when that is the norm, right? Where that is the reality, that there is on so many fundamental levels, just like zero accountability to kind of basic notions of, and where what even, what people at least could point to as an institution through which they could sort of make specific kinds of claims, right, are now so diffuse that they don't, that it's hard to even kind of gauge where that is anymore. Yeah, just a comment. Thank you.
Roger? First of all, I really appreciate the talks and the discussion that we're having, particularly the injection of art and literature, because actually that's something I've been a human rights advocate for a long time, with occasional forays, safe forays into academia. And we've used, as much as we can, celebrities, media exposure, for the simple fact that that elevates the issue. But I think it goes deeper, and you were pointing to that, which is that words matter. Words have power. Words are placeholders for meaning, and they're contested. And I share the frustration of Paul and others with the hostile takeover of words by, say, powerful interests, not just freedom. I mean, there's a whole litany, community-based development, all of these things are meaningful. But once they are taken over and put forward sometimes to mean their opposite, according to what I understand it, that's a huge problem. But to me, the answer is to contest and reclaim. And so, yeah, I mean, I think maybe as a question, to put that into a question, how do you feel that words have made or can make a difference in this search for accountability? We've already talked about the word of accountability itself, but I'd be interested to hear that.
James?
Yeah, I'll try to be kind of brief. Just want to make a quick point that in the world of global health, the architecture of global health, there is quite a rhetoric of accountability out there, and evaluation, and it's being pushed and promoted in this period of big data. Some people have rolled out the term audit culture. I work with an organization, we get lots of funding from big donors, and the onerous amounts of data collection we have to do to satisfy the donors is all in the name of accountability and evaluation. So it's being rolled out. I'm just thinking about your term, it's kind of a hostile takeover of this, because, and this is something I'll talk about this afternoon, is how it kind of misses the point. Much of the data that's collected isn't measuring the right things. So there is sort of this idea out there about accountability, and it's being used to obfuscate, I think, arguably, rather than actually lead to greater accountability. So I hopefully we can kind of unpack the way that global health has been using that.
So why don't we give both of you the last word? Just a lot of great ideas.
Yeah.
So last words, because I think you're going to need words to really
Yeah.
some of this. Do you want to start, Dora?
Yeah, I'm very glad that that the focus came to how we use words and how we need to reclaim them, because otherwise we don't have a discourse, we don't have a way of refreshing the discourse. I don't know what solutions there are. What I hope, since we're all optimists here, I mean, why would we be talking about these issues if we didn't think change were possible? I would hope we could imagine ways to use words in new ways or to coin new words. One of the series of talks that we have in Cultural Agents is called Cultural Agents Coin New Words, because we need to refresh the discourse. Why not think of different instruments of measurement? What are we measuring? I mean, why not make technical interventions that really change the game? Who's your colleague who only worried about what Chan would say? Oh, you don't have to name names. Okay, you don't have to name names.
You know, I'm torn. I'd like to say his name, but I know there's people in this room.
No, that's fine. No, but that's fine. No, don't name names. But if we had a structure in which leaders of NGOs and their advisors would sit in circles with villagers who are reluctant to make claims, but who could form a good question. If we simply had different structures of association, because as administrators and caregivers, we understood ourselves and other people to be creative, maybe we could unstick some of the obstacles without changing systems in a frontal way. I like Paulo Freire a lot, because living in a revolutionary period as he lived, he decided he liked Che Guevara and not Fidel Castro, because Che Guevara was a doctor, and he talked about love. And Freire was basically a Jesuit. And he says, if you want to change the world, it's through wedges. Find an empty space, find an opportunity, occupy it, grow it, and then the system will be affected, will change. So I would like to invite Paul, other friends, all of us who are stuck, to think more creatively about existing structures and how to find the wedges there and get voices to intervene in genres that are less threatening. And I'll just say one word about TB. The reason I'm here is because Mercedes Becerra and I are working in Peru on TB. We don't know yet what the interventions will be, but we know that they have to be different from what they have been. And that's the name of art. We're hoping that creative people, including patients and their caregivers, will come up with really clever and fun things. Another thing I learned from Mayor Mokus is that without pleasure, nothing good happens. And your case from Mali is a good example of that. Pleasure is part of health. And I think that if we can imagine ways of associating that are pleasurable and edgy, we'll be in a process that goes somewhere. I don't know where. I mean, I certainly don't have answers, but I have a little fire that's called art.
Yeah. Well, it was wonderful listening to all those quote-unquote questions. I would very happily sit here for the rest of the day and listen to those kinds of questions and learn a lot from listening to them. I guess I only have just a very few things to say. I don't know that I have very much to add. You know, thinking about this, the problem of what happens, right, when the International Tribunal goes away. The book that I'm working on, one of the books I'm working on right now, is about gender discrimination cases from Russia and Turkey at the European Court of Human Rights. And one of the things that me and my co-author, Lisa McIntosh-Sundstrom, who's at the University of British Columbia, and I were finding is, of course, Russia is a member of the Council of Europe, and therefore, since 1998, its citizens can send cases to the European Court of Human Rights. We were particularly interested in gender discrimination because there's an awful lot of gender discrimination in Russia, and there's only been one case that's actually, now it's two, but that have gone through the European Court of Human Rights and come up with a judgment against Russia, and it was a case that was brought by a man. And so we were trying to figure out where are the obstacles, and what can be done, and without getting into all of that, I think the point that's clearest to us coming out of Russia and Turkey is that you need to have a significant sized cluster of people who can do strategic litigation. Doing it abroad is great, but you can also do it at home. But if you're coming up against a government that just frankly doesn't care, that's when you need the transnational court, to sort of at least have a little bit of an influence on that state, because the state's reputation might be in question. But let's look at a case like Russia. Russia doesn't care. The state there thinks that the judgment of the international community is irrelevant. So it's a terrific problem, and I have no idea what else to really to say about that. And in terms of the words matter problem, I think it's so true. Words really matter. And so if the meaning of accountability has gotten really conflated and turned around, like, I think a year ago, fake news meant the kind of news that you get out of Breitbart, and now it means the kind of news you get out of the New York Times. I mean, it's so confusing. But I guess the thing I would say about accountability is maybe the word is bad, and maybe it's being used to mean kind of not what it was originally intended. Probably what's important for us is to figure out, what do we want? Like, what are the kinds of, I'll use the word like accountability or responsibility relationships that we would like to see established? Who will be held responsible? And if it requires using another word, fine. But I think figuring out first what's desired, like what is it that we want to have, and then working toward establishing that might be good. And in terms of it's absolutely true. While there was that wave of democratization going on, there was also that rise of globalization and neoliberalism. And one of the saddest aspects of that is, of course, the myth that was being spread at the time, which is, you will have democracy and you will have capitalism. And those two things together, you're going to live well. I actually think that's what the emphasis was on. It wasn't like, you'll be able to make choices and have your own political free will. At the end of the day, I think most of the people in the former Soviet Union thought, once we have democracy, we're going to live like they live on TV, on Dynasty and on the soap operas. And that was soundly disappointing, through the 1990s. And that's what made room for people like Putin, who could come along and say, yeah, you've been enfeebled and I'm going to make you strong again. Never mind about your political, nobody's even saying, but what about my political choice? So I think the issues that you all raised were really meaningful and important.
Yes, they are.
It's interesting. I remember being in the backwoods of Tajikistan, and on the TV there would be Dallas.
Right, exactly. Dallas is what I was going to say. Everybody thought they would live like Dallas. Exactly. You would drink liquor in the middle of the day out of the beautiful glass-cut canister, and you'd wear an evening gown, at all times.
The life we all strive for.
Yeah.
Can I just say that the most popular soap operas now in Latin America are Turkish?
Really?
Yeah.
Used to be the most popular soap operas in Russia. We're Latin American.
We're Latin American, that's
Mexican
right.
soaps.
That's right.
Yeah, Wild Rose.
Well, Valerie and Doris, thank you so much for
Thank
such
you
a
so
rich
much.
start to this conference. Really
Thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much.